be talking about the minority languages of China. So I'm going to start us off today with a short video. This is a Chinese minority language called Tatar. It's spoken by the Tatar Chinese that live in the Xinjiang region, which you've probably heard of because of the Uyghur, but actually the Uyghur are just one of many other minorities that live in that region. So you're going to hear the Tatar language, and when she first starts speaking, you're going to hear Tatar. Then she's going to translate what she's saying into Mandarin.
Isamsiz, menim ismim Rofiya, Chaushak xaldan kelem, Chongqing xalqni bek yaxshi ko'ram. 大家好，我叫鲁菲亚，我来自塔城，我特别喜欢重庆。
So I just wanted to start this talk off with a video that hopefully surprised you a little bit. It may be difficult to surprise this crowd, the Polyglot Conference crowd, but I just wanted to set the tone by showing you an example of a thriving language in China that is really different from Mandarin, or really different from the Sinitic languages in China. So probably everyone here has heard of Mandarin, probably you've all heard of Cantonese, maybe you've even heard of Hokkien or Shanghainese, but today I really want to draw attention to the many, many languages within China's borders that come from cultures that are very different from the Sinitic languages and the Han majority culture, which is what you're probably more familiar with. So before we forget about the video that we just watched, let me tell you a little bit more about Tatar, and then I'll properly introduce myself and launch into everything else. But the Tatar minority originate from the Volga region of Russia towards Russia's west, as well as the region of Crimea, and they're actually Russia's largest minority group as well. So this language is still widely used outside of China, in Russia of course, as well as in other parts of Central Asia. But the dialect spoken within China is actually a purer form with less influence from modern Russian. And this is a phenomenon that you'll actually see a lot in minority languages in China, which is because these languages and these cultures within China were allowed to be pretty autonomous for a long time. They weren't as culturally affected by the influence of other dominant powers in the region like the former USSR. So you see this with languages like Mongolian as well, that the version that's used inside China is a little bit more preserved, sort of as if it were preserved in amber, more preserved than the Mongolian used in Mongolia today, which has been heavily influenced by Russian. And we'll get to Mongolian later. But let's talk more about the Tatar. So the Tatar are mostly Muslim, and if you are not that familiar with China, then you probably still have heard about Chinese Muslims, but you've probably mostly heard about the Uyghur, which do show up a lot in Western media. But the Uyghur are actually only one of many Muslim ethnic groups in China, many of whom have their own languages, for example the Salar. And of course, since I'm talking to a bunch of linguists and polyglots, I know you'll want to know about the Tatar language. It's a Turkic language, so it's related to languages like Turkish, Uyghur, Kazakh. In China, it's mostly written with the Arabic script, and as a Turkic language, it has all those Turkic goodies like vowel harmony and agglutinative grammar. Okay, so I'm going to zoom back out now that I've hopefully shocked you with a video of a Caucasian woman speaking perfect Chinese, as well as a Chinese minority language. I always find that's a great way to start a talk, in my opinion. But I'll tell you a little bit more about myself so that you know where I'm coming from. So my day job is running a language services company. We specialize in Asian language data services, but my real passion is just learning languages. I've learned a few languages to fluency, but I really just love learning a little bit about a lot of languages. Really, I just love dipping my toes into the grammatical structure and the vocabulary and using that to get a window into the culture and the history of any given language. And luckily, because of the nature of my job, which works very well remotely and which involves doing a lot of international networking, international travel, I'm usually on the road a lot for work. So I really got used to getting to travel and learn about new cultures and learn new languages, keep my linguist brain very active. But of course, suddenly in about February of this year, that stopped being the case pretty abruptly, because that's when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And global travel pretty much screeched to a halt. And I was in China when that happened, where I had just moved to Beijing. So far in China, we've actually been very lucky. Life has been back to normal now for several months, knock on wood. I don't know if a lot will have changed by the time you're watching this. But for the last few months, we've barely had any coronavirus cases at all. And the borders are closed to almost all international incoming travel. So that means that it has been pretty safe to travel around the country as a domestic traveler. And let me tell you, if a linguist were going to be stuck in a country, if you couldn't cross any borders, then China is really the place to be. You've probably heard that China has something like over 300 languages, and that's exciting enough for a linguist. But what I wasn't aware of for a long time was just how drastically different those languages are. So like I said, you've probably heard of Mandarin and Cantonese and all these other Sinitic languages, but like I've already shown you, there's a whole family of languages in Western China that are actually closer to Turkish than to any Asian language, and each of those languages have really unique histories and cultures. And there are also languages that are closer to their Indic or Indian or Austronesian ancestors, and also languages that are completely unique, language isolates that aren't related to any nearby languages. And these are languages that are written with completely different alphabets than the characters used in the rest of China. They have their own crazy grammars, and in many cases they come from civilizations that long predate what we know of as China today. So I've been fascinated by Chinese minority languages for years. I've studied them on and off, starting in grad school, and now that I'm stuck in China, like I said, I've finally had the time and the opportunity to really dig in, to travel around China and to get to know more about these fascinating languages. Okay, so now you have some of the context of why I'm so interested in the minority languages of China. So let's start off by quickly talking about the majority language and the majority culture of modern China. So when we think of China today, we mostly think of the Han. On the left, we have a picture of a woman wearing traditional Han clothing, or Hanfu, which is actually making a pretty serious comeback. So lots of young Chinese today wear Hanfu on the street, as inspired by period dramas that are very popular. So I'll show you what modern Chinese street style looks like. This is what Han Chinese are wearing on the streets of Beijing and Shanghai. And the Han themselves actually speak hundreds of languages, including Mandarin, as well as Cantonese, Hokkien, Hakka, languages in the Sinitic language family. We'll talk about that in a second. But for a long time, parts or all of China were also ruled by non-Han people. So the Mongols at times ruled parts of China. The Manchu ruled China during its last modern dynasty. And in the last couple of centuries, China's borders have also stretched to encompass regions that were previously autonomous, and the distinct languages spoken in those areas are still spoken there today. So prior to the Han taking control, large swaths of China were also settled by many different sub-tribes of Turkic and Mongol peoples with all kinds of names that you're probably not familiar with. And these regions eventually did come under the control of various Chinese dynasties and Han dynasties and Manchu dynasties, and they are still considered to be part of modern China today, but they've retained a lot of their heritage, including both culture and language. And then finally, you have the languages at the border. So if you've ever traveled in regions with lots of small countries that are closely packed together, like Europe, for example, you've probably noticed that a border does not necessarily mean a sharp delineation of language and culture. So usually languages sort of seep across borders in a kind of gradient. And that's often because these borders have moved and changed over time. So in China, you'll still hear a lot of the languages that are shared with the countries over their borders, such as Korean or Uyghur, which is closely related to Kazakh, Mongolian, and several of the minority languages that are shared with minorities in Vietnam and Myanmar. So now's probably a good time to look at a map of China and get ourselves situated with respect to the language families of China. They're not actually as neatly placed as this map would have you believe. Some languages especially are pretty scattered and spread out, but this will give you a good overview at least. So you can see that Mandarin covers a good swath of the country, although of course the farther you get from Beijing, the harder it gets to really call it Mandarin. So if you get on a slow train starting in Beijing and you start traveling south, as I did once, you really notice that with every stop, the people that get on the train get harder and harder to understand. So you'll also see that there is a lot of variation in the south, which makes sense since it is not home to the official language. And you'll see some languages that you might have heard of there: Cantonese, Shanghainese, Taiwanese, which is also called Hokkien. And I'll just point out a comparatively pretty big swath of land where Korean is spoken, and of course Tibetan to the west and Uyghur in the northwest. So those are some really big swaths of China that can really be considered to be very bilingual. I'd say even on the border of the Tibetan Autonomous Region, it feels like the equivalent of being in Catalonia, so where Spanish and Catalan are both being spoken in pretty equal measure. So once again, I want to point out that a lot of China's languages actually come from completely different language families. So Uyghur and Tibetan are very far removed from Mandarin and Cantonese. And of course, usually if a country has more than one language, the languages will be more or less related to each other, right? So like how Switzerland has French, German, and Italian. But sometimes for historical reasons, a country will have languages that are completely unrelated to the others. For example, in Spain, we have the Basque language, which is not a Romance language at all. Or in Mexico, we have Spanish, which is not at all related to any of the indigenous languages that existed there for thousands of years before Spanish showed up. And of course, in both of those cases, we can think conquest. And in China's case, things are no different. Territories that were not originally Han-controlled actually comprise over half of China's land. And that's because between the years 1755 and 1792, the imperial armies of the Qing imperial government, which was actually a Manchu government, they weren't Han, came to all the areas, all the way from Xinjiang to Mongolia to Tibet, all of southern China, from Yunnan to Hong Kong and Taiwan for certain parts of history. And even though the Manchu are no longer in charge, those boundaries more or less still exist today. So there are 56 recognized ethnicities in China. There's Han, and then the 55 minorities. And most of those can fit linguistically into one of these 10 main language families. So we have the Sinitic language family, so what we know of as Chinese, essentially, so Mandarin, Cantonese, Hakka, Hokkien, and the rest of those. We also have the Mongolian language family, the Manchu family, which is also known as Tungus. We have Tibeto-Burman, Turkic, so Turkic includes Uyghur and Salar, Tatar, many of those. We also have Korean, Miao Yao, Hmong Khmer, Thai, and then unclassified. So basically a grab bag of every language where we don't know where to put it. And I'm going to start with the Sinitic language family because I know many of you may still be relatively new to the Chinese languages and probably still have some questions about the more widely known languages like Cantonese or Shanghainese. So I'll touch briefly on those. So in the north, as we saw on the map, we have Mandarin. Mandarin pretty much is the language spoken throughout most of the north, although like I said, if you get on a bus and start traveling, it starts to get a little bit different the farther away that you get. But in the south, you have a lot more variety. So you have the Wu family, which is the family that Shanghainese belongs to. You might have heard of Shanghainese. We also have Gan and Xiang and Hakka and Yue, which is what we English speakers know of as Cantonese, and Min. And I'm not going to try to pronounce Shanghainese, but you can see how similar Shanghainese and Cantonese are to Mandarin, even though Mandarin has lost almost all of its word final consonants, you'll notice. Each of these languages, Shanghainese, Cantonese, Mandarin, they have very different tonal systems, very different phonemes or sounds, and they're not mutually intelligible. So a Mandarin speaker cannot necessarily understand Cantonese. But when you lie them all side by side like this with this word or for happiness, you can definitely see the relationships. Okay, let's switch on to Mongolian now. So Mongolian is a particularly interesting case because outside of China's borders lies Mongolia, or the country of Mongolia, or what China likes to call Outer Mongolia, to contrast with what they call Inner Mongolia, which is part of China. So basically, Outer Mongolia is still governed by Mongolians, and it's the country that the rest of the world just calls Mongolia, whereas Inner Mongolia is in this region here, outlined in red. That's considered to be part of China. And the presence of an entire state, the state of Mongolia, that claims this ethnicity and this language and this historical heritage right next to China, has definitely helped contribute to the strength of the Mongolian identity today of Inner Mongolians inside of China as well. And that's contributed to the preservation of the language too. But obviously usage within China of the language is very different to its usage in Mongolia in a few respects. So for example, in Mongolia, which was part of the USSR for many years, they actually long ago gave up using the Old Mongolian alphabet, which I'll show you in a bit, and they've started using the Cyrillic alphabet instead. So that's the Russian alphabet, and they've used that for most of this century. So here's what those two writing systems look like. So on the bottom is a modified Cyrillic alphabet used for Mongolian. So if you read Russian, you'll notice that there's an odd-looking letter in there that's not used in Russian. That's only used in Mongolian as far as I know. Whereas the alphabet used in Inner Mongolia is on the top, and that's actually the original old alphabet. So they've actually preserved its usage in China this whole time. But don't forget, a language is different from an alphabet, right? So the language is actually mostly the same. The spoken language is mostly the same in Inner and Outer Mongolia. It's just the way that they write it that was different. And actually, as an aside, the Mongolian government just decided in March of this year, 2020, that they want to return to the traditional Mongolian script. So they'll actually be using both scripts starting in 2025. And then the Mongolian used on both sides of the border will have the same writing system. But once again, this is a really interesting example of how the language inside of China was sort of preserved and has kind of preserved its more traditional usage as compared to the communities living outside of China. Okay, let's move on to Manchu. So even if you're not that familiar with Chinese history, you've probably heard of the Manchu people, or maybe Manchuria, which is the name of a geographic region encompassing part of northern China as well as part of Russia and part of North Korea, which used to be primarily home to the Manchu people. And these people speak Tungusic languages. That's the name of the language family. This family has uncertain origins, but is definitely not Sinitic, definitely not related to Chinese, potentially distantly related to Turkish, but linguists are still really conflicted about that. If you're familiar with the Altaic language controversy, then I can say that this language family has been considered for inclusion within the Altaic family, which would include Mongolian, Korean, and Turkish. But like I said, the whole existence of an Altaic family is still considered pretty controversial, and I'm not going to get into that here. But suffice to say, this is a really unique language. And unfortunately, Manchu is not thriving in China as a spoken language, but it is still learned in schools, and it is still considered an important part of Manchurian heritage. In China, most descendants of the Manchus are very aware and proud of their heritage, and they do try to pass on at least the ability to read and write, as you can see in this picture. And actually, it's ironic, but one of the reasons why Manchu as a language is not thriving today is precisely because the Manchu were once so powerful that they controlled all of China as the last imperial dynasty, the Qing dynasty, which lasted for 3 centuries. So in fact, when the Manchurians settled in China and took control, they adopted Mandarin as their main language for communicating with the locals, mostly because they were outnumbered, and also just because they had to pick one language, and Mandarin was it. And Mandarin was not yet, at that time, Mandarin was not the official language of China. It was just something that the Manchus randomly picked. So it's always really interesting to me to look back at these historical conquests and wonder why in some cases they imposed their language upon the locals, and why in others they adopted the local language. So I've gone down a few Wikipedia rabbit holes trying to figure out why the Manchurians wouldn't force the Chinese to use the Manchurian language, but I'm not a historian. Mostly it seems that they just didn't have enough numbers to be able to spread it or enforce it. But if anyone else has more information on that, I'd be so fascinated to hear more about it. So culturally, the Manchu influence is very well known in China. In fact, there was recently an extremely popular TV show called Yanxi Palace. This show takes place in the Qing dynasty, and like I said, it's extremely popular in the Sinosphere. Even my mother has watched it. In fact, my mother has watched the whole series twice, and my mother has no Chinese heritage. Unfortunately, they don't use Manchu in the show. It's all in Mandarin. But it still is a really interesting depiction of Manchurian life in China. Okay, so let's move on to another language family, the Tibeto-Burman family. This family has quite a few big representatives in China, including, of course, Tibetan. Tibetan is a very old language with an extensive literature and culture, and in fact, the Tibetan Empire once ruled an area that stretched far beyond what is now considered the Tibetan Plateau, including throughout East Asia, Central Asia, and South Asia. So I took these pictures just a few weeks ago. I went to Qinghai in order to learn more about the Tibetan language and Tibetan culture, and was absolutely delighted to hear the language all around me and to see it written on all the street signs. In these pictures you can see how vibrant their art and their architecture is. On the left is a Tibetan couple taking their wedding pictures, and then in the next 3 pictures you can see Tibetan temples and monks. The Tibetans are deeply religious. Unlike most of the Han majority, they're mostly Buddhist, so their language and their religion are very tightly intertwined. I was really lucky to come across this group of Tibetans who were throwing what they call lungta, or wind horses, which are small pieces of paper or cloth with prayers written on them in Tibetan. And I'll play a video now so you can see them and you can hear them shouting in Tibetan while they throw these wind horses into the air. by the way, to get to that mountaintop, I had hiked to 3,000 meters above sea level, so I was already feeling a little bit lightheaded, a little bit woozy when they showed up, and they ended up being so friendly and so enthusiastic, and the experience was just so surreal. They actually gave me a box of lungta to throw myself. Yeah, like I said, it was just a very surreal experience. The really cool thing about Qinghai for me was just how the Tibetan language was everywhere. So all the signs were bilingual Chinese-Tibetan, and Tibetan really was the language spoken on the street. We heard it everywhere. You could tell that many of the locals were much more comfortable speaking Tibetan than Chinese, even though most of their education is now in Mandarin. So Tibetan is not the only language in this family. The Tibeto-Burman language family have not actually been subject to very much study because they're mostly spoken in very mountainous regions that are hard to access. And to be honest, linguists freely admit that a lot of the languages in this family have only very loose ties to one another. Some are much more strongly influenced by Chinese languages, others by Indian languages. Most of them are highly tonal, as in much more complex tonal systems than Mandarin. But they also have much more complex grammatical systems than Mandarin. So they have verb agreement, they have affixes, which are characteristics you don't see in the Sinitic languages. And in this picture, you can see the native dress of the Bai ethnic minority. They are found much more to the south, closer to the border with Burma. Okay, one of my favorite languages, since I lived in Korea for 6 years, is the Korean language. 2.3 million Koreans are living in China, many of whom have been there since before China and Korea were even recognized states, but also many of whom have immigrated in the last few hundred years, most of them being from North Korea. So in China, Korean speakers are referred to as Chaosianzu, with Chaosian being the name for North Korea. China doesn't actually say North and South Korea. They actually use the names that these countries use for themselves, which are Chosun for North Korea, and Hanguk for South Korea. Hanguk actually means Han country, and confusingly, this Han is not the same as the Chinese Han. It's actually a totally different Han. That's what you get when you don't have very many phonemes in your language. But anyway, many of the descendants of the original Koreans actually assimilated pretty early into the Chinese Han or the Mongol or the Manchu communities, and so they're no longer considered Korean or maybe even know that they're Korean. So most of the recognizable Korean minority who still speak Korean are actually from relatively more recent emigration during the Qing dynasty. And these immigrants come mostly from the Hamgyong region of North Korea, so they speak the North Korean dialect, although they have been heavily influenced by South Korean media in the last century. And in the Yanbian Autonomous Prefecture, which is the region with the most Korean speakers, Korean is still taught in schools. Children receive a bilingual Korean Mandarin education. When I was living in Korea, I actually remember that we would often get Chaosianzu in our Korean school. They were obviously from China and spoke perfect Mandarin, but they often also spoke very fluent Korean already. They just needed to learn how to read and write and how to use the language a little bit more formally. So they would often come to South Korea for that. Okay, so moving on to the Miao Yao family. This group is one of the most dispersed language families to be found in China. You can find speakers of the Miao in pockets all around the continent as well as in Southeast Asia, which is largely due to violent struggles with the Chinese military from the 1700s to the mid-1800s, during which time many of the Miao fled to other parts of China and throughout Southeast Asia. One of the languages from this family that might be pretty well known to foreigners is the Hmong language. That language originated in the Yellow River part of China, but now has very large populations in Vietnam, in Laos, in Thailand, and in Myanmar, as well as pretty large populations of immigrants in the United States after the U.S. recruited them to fight in the Vietnam War. So I'll play this video I found on YouTube so you can see some of their really stunning dress. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any videos of their language, but you can at least see what their traditional clothing looks like. And the Miao Yao languages have several tones. They also use creakiness and breathiness as phonemic distinctions. And according to Hmong legend, they used to have their own writing system too, but that has since been lost. Okay, moving on to the Hmong Khmer family. So the most well-known language in this family is obviously Khmer, so the main language of Cambodia. But in addition, a well-known Hmong Khmer language is the Wa language of Yunnan. And the Wa people are pictured here in this video. So the Wa peoples are best known in China for being headhunters. So literal headhunters, as in they would keep skulls outside of each village to guard against evil spirits and intrusions. So for this reason, they were pretty much left alone by the Chinese, they were left alone by the Japanese, by the British, and by pretty much anyone else that came to China for a long time until the mid-1900s. So they definitely preserved their culture and their language quite well. The Wa have several different writing systems, actually, including the Roman alphabet. The Roman alphabet became particularly widespread because of a very successful Christian missionary from Nebraska in the United States that converted a large portion of the Wa. So a lot of them use the Roman alphabet. But Wa that are closer to the Burmese border and in Burma also use a completely different script, which is the Shan language script. That's a minority language in Burma. Okay, and finally the Thai. The Thai are not to be confused with the Thai of Thailand, although linguistically they are related. But this group is in China, and it includes languages such as the Dai, the Zhuang, the Kham, the Li, and the Li live on a Hainan island, and a few other groups. And the Thai languages are quite varied actually in their characteristics, so in the interest of time and also due to a lack of expertise on this particular family, I'm just going to leave it there with the Thai. But you can check back in with me next year and see if I've finally made it to Hainan to learn more about this language family. So thank you so much for watching. There are so many other languages that I could talk about today, so much more depth that I could go into about the sociolinguistics of minority languages in China. Suffice to say, it is very complicated and, of course, very politically weighted. So it is for the best that I don't get into that here. But I can say that I really have been so amazed to see how much many of these languages are really present in everyday life, that you really do hear them on the street, you see them written on signs, and many of them are even still taught in schools. But of course the situation is very different, very unique for every minority language in China. Some are in a quite precarious situation. For example, Manchu, like I mentioned, is down to its last handful of native speakers. So I hope that was an enlightening, let's see how long, 20 minutes for you. So whether you are a Sinophile like me or whether you're completely new to the world of Asian languages, I hope you had a good time. If you have more questions or you want to follow me on social media, you can also check out my handles here on this slide. I write sporadically about languages and about language learning on my blog at misslinguistic.com. But Instagram is really where I put more of my little observations about languages and language histories. So if you need any Asian language services, you can check out my company, Meridian Linguistics. And lastly, if you are interested in a totally different story, the story of a small town in Mexico where they still speak an ancient form of Venetian, and how I learned a little bit of Venetian in order to travel there, then you can check out my other talk at this conference. It is in Spanish, but it'll have English subtitles. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.